They say what you don't have, you don't miss. And I know what I've got, what I've had. I can't think of any other place that I would rather be. Naturally, in the life I've had, like we've all had, we visit so many other churches. And they're not anything compared to what we have. It's a way of life.
I think what makes St. Nicholas so unique is that we're like one big family. That's how I feel, because I really don't have that much family. But at least you come here and mostly everybody knows you and says hello to you. I've been to other churches and nobody even looks at you twice.
I have a lot of cousins, and some of them are Orthodox, but they don't necessarily go here. And I don't have any interaction with them except on family occasions. And by coming here, I have an entire family of people.
Many years we had all kind of parties, wedding, christening, but that was, I would say, was our second home, 10th Street.
Street. St. Nicholas of Myra Orthodox Church stands in the corner of East 10th Street and Avenue A on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. For more than 75 years, this red brick building has been home to a unique religious community. The parishioners of St. Nicholas belong to the second largest Christian denomination in the world, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Most share a common ethnic and cultural background. Today, more than 90% of its members can still trace their roots to 3 small villages in Carpatska Rus, or Carpatho-Russia, in Central Europe. The original founders of St. Nicholas Church came to America to escape poverty and to seek a better life for themselves and their children. In their homeland, their religious faith was at the center of their lives. When they settled in America, they immediately sought a place to worship. This is the story of the parishioners of St. Nicholas Church, a story about a group of people whose strong religious faith made them part of a larger family, and like all families, they shared in each other's triumphs and failures and joys and sorrows. They occasionally disagreed, but then reconciled. Today, they continue to call 10th Street their second home. The Carpatho-Russian region is nestled along the northern and southern slopes of the Carpathian Mountains, stretching across the borders of Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and the Ukraine. It has never been an independent state, but instead is defined by an ethnic group who for centuries have shared a common language and a rich cultural heritage. These people are known by several names: Carpatho-Russians, Carpatho-Rusins, Rusins, or Ruthenians.
This is considered to be a region because the people who inhabit it developed a sense of unity, despite the fact that for centuries they were divided by political borders.
The founders of the church lived in Yarabina, Litmanova, and Kamyonka, 3 small farming villages, each only several miles apart, in the Prešov region of Carpatho-Russia, in what is today the Republic of Slovakia. Before the turn of the 20th century, the villagers rarely left their towns except to seek seasonal work within the surrounding lands. The vast majority lived and died within the same village they were born in. So closely associated were they to their towns, a villager's name often identified the town they were from. Up until the year 1054 A.D., there existed one single Christian church, known as the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The church had 4 seats of authority, known as sees, or patriarchates. The western see was situated in Rome, and the eastern sees were in the cities of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. A bishop or patriarch headed each see. In the year 324 AD, Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to the city of Constantinople in Byzantium, the eastern part of the empire. Constantinople became the fifth see. Within time, the relationship between the Western churches in Rome and the Eastern churches in Byzantium weakened. Two separate and distinct forms of Christian ideology began to emerge. In the year 1054, unable to resolve their differences, the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church split and became two separate churches, the Orthodox Church in the East and the Roman Catholic Church in the West. The split became known as the Great Schism. In the three villages and throughout Carpatho-Russia, the church has always been the central part of village life.
Now, there are several groups for which religion is a symbol of their ethnicity. They're fused, religion and ethnicity. The Greeks are an important example, or the Polish Roman Catholics. And for the Carpatho-Russians, I think religion was the main mark of their ethnic identity.
The majority of Carpatho-Russians were either Orthodox or Greek Catholic. The Greek Catholics were under the Church of Rome. Historically, Carpatho-Russian Greek Catholics were rooted in Orthodoxy. They were known as Eastern Rite Catholics, or followers of the Eastern Rite. Like the Orthodox, they followed the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. They received leavened bread and wine together during communion rather than separately, held their church services in Church Slavonic rather than Latin, and permitted their priests to marry before ordination. Most scholars believe that two Greek monks, Cyril and Methodius, the apostles to the Slavs, first introduced the inhabitants of Carpatho-Russia to Christianity.
The introduction of Christianity is very much linked to the original settlement of the region. If we assume that Russians or the ancestors of Russians lived in the Carpathians already in the 6th or 7th century, then it is very likely possible that the Russians were baptized or received Christianity at some point during the late 9th century from two Greek monks, Cyril and Methodius, or from their followers. No matter when this happened, it surely came in the form of the Eastern Rite. So when the church split into what later became the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, and what happened in the year 1054, the Russians remained remained in the sphere of influence of the Orthodox Church.
The two brothers also brought the people of Carpatho-Russia a literary language and an alphabet.
They brought the Church Slavonic language to our people. They are credited by historians for translating the scripture into Slavonic, the liturgical texts, and bringing an alphabet to these Slavic tribes of present-day Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and also the Carpathians.
In the second half of the 16th century, the Prešov region became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Habsburg family, who were Roman Catholics, ruled the empire. When the Protestant Reformation swept Europe, the Habsburgs tried to strengthen their Catholic reign by bringing the Orthodox Church under their control. The Catholic leaders created unions or pacts with various Orthodox clergy throughout the region. Through the Union of Brest in 1596, the Orthodox churches in the region agreed to recognize the primacy of the Pope and submit to Roman theology and doctrine. In return, they were permitted to keep their Eastern Rite practices, as well as a married priesthood.
And this act was followed some 50 years later on the southern slope of the Carpathians, where several priests accepted the so-called Union of Uzhhorod in the year 1646, and by this act they created the Uniate Church south of the Carpathians. Many Russians opposed this, but since the union was backed up by the authorities, they really had to obey. And so it really took several decades before the last Orthodox parish disappeared from the Carpathians, but from early 18th century and up to the late 19th centuries, there were no Orthodox parishes in the region, as all of the Rusyns were Greek Catholic.
Under the reign of Empress Maria Theresa in the 1700s, the Orthodox Church was officially banned by the Hungarian state. In some instances, peasants who professed their Orthodox faith were imprisoned or fined. By the early 1700s, the three villages had become Greek Catholic or Uniate, and they remained that way until villagers came to America. Back in the villages, this would change by the turn of the century. The inhabitants of the three villages first began their migration to America during the mid-1800s as social and agricultural conditions in the region began to decline. This opportunity to leave came when the American coal mining and steel mill industries, seeking cheap labor, turned to the hard-working Carpatho-Russians.
There were agents operating in Russian villages who were hired mostly by coal mines from America. And as they were moving from village to village, they described to the Russians the opportunity in America. They described America as the land where everybody can get a job.
Between 1877 and 1914, approximately 225,000 Carpatho-Russians immigrated to the United States. In some villages, as many as 1/4 of the inhabitants were in America. The founders of the 10th Street Church were part of this great migration.
It is important to understand that at the beginning, they were coming here to make and save money and to return home. They would return home, they would buy some land, they would build a new house, but eventually the money would be gone and another trip to America would be a necessity. So many traveled back and forth, but then here again, some got tired of that and decided simply to stay where the work was. So that's how the Russian community in America began.
During the First World War, emigration was halted, but then resumed in 1920. This time, the new immigrants were mostly women and children who were journeying to America to join their husbands and fathers who had left before the war.
My father had been here for a couple of years. He came because of my aunt, and his brother were here, and my uncle was here, and I guess they brought him over. They sponsored him and brought him over, and after he was here a couple of years, he sent for us.
In 1924, a national quota was enacted preventing immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe from entering the United States. Between 1920 and 1938, only 600 immigrants from Carpatho-Russia came to America each year, as compared to 6,000 during the Great Migration.
I come from Yarambina. First time I came here, 1923. I was 5 weeks on a road. From my home to my sister's home on Atlantic Avenue. Took me 5 weeks.
At first, the immigrants from the three villages settled in eastern and western Pennsylvania, in towns such as Johnstown, Conemaugh, and Star Junction, to work in the coal mines and the steel mills. By 1910, the immigrants chose to settle in Lower Manhattan, across the river from Ellis Island, where they first disembarked. They lived in the tenement buildings that stood beneath the towering skyscrapers of the Lower Battery. The tenements soon filled with families from the towns. It was as if the villages were transported to America.
Then we moved to 49 Washington. Oh, the whole building was the Gaiduses, the Chisolkas, the Korchaks were there, Balashes were there.
The 4- and 5-story walk-ups were small and cramped. Each apartment 2 to 3 rooms. In most cases, there was a wood-burning stove and a sink with only one faucet and cold running water.
There were 4 families on a floor, so you shared the toilet and you shared the sink. And everybody in that apartment house had been in Europe, and they were all friends, and everybody knew everybody else. So in the morning, the women would go to the sink, you see, and they were on different levels, but that didn't matter. They just talked through it. And they would say, well, what are you cooking today? And then so would say, kapusta. And then they decided, well, that's going to be the menu for the day. And then you walked into the apartment, into the house, and everybody had kapusta for the day.
Fathers, uncles, and cousins who came first to America brought other family members over. They gave them a place to live until they could find work and go off on their own. They, in turn, did the same for the next group of immigrants. Each time a relative came, they needed to prepare the necessary papers.
I bring 11 people from Europe over here. I make paper 13 times.
The affidavit have to be approved by council in Prague. It was much easy to make an affidavit if they were making more money or better job. And if they didn't have enough money to bring me over or to support me, they will let you come.
There were often 7 or 8 people living in 2 to 3 room apartments. Despite the hardships, they continued to help each other.
But in 1920, we came to New York to my uncle Pete Herco. Pete Herco, at that time, had 4 children. So we came, my mother and I, to a family already loaded with kids.
As first-generation immigrants, they did not have much. They were very poor.
Where we lived in downtown Manhattan was a poorer neighborhood than you can associate today with Harlem, say. Later on, when I went to Harlem and saw what Harlem had and what we had downtown Manhattan, I thought that Harlem was the lap of luxury.
Despite their poverty, the immigrants were hardworking and industrious. Both mothers and fathers worked as unskilled laborers for the businesses that were located in Lower Manhattan.
One reason I think that they lived there, because they all worked in the office buildings. You see, the people that came from Europe weren't very well educated. They were all farmers. That was their trade. They didn't know anything else. So when they got here, people recognized them as honest people and industrious people and people that can be trusted, so that it was easy for them to find a job.
They first found work in the local restaurants and stores that supported the offices around Wall Street. They found jobs for each other. Many of them worked 6 days a week at minimum wages. The men also worked as porters, elevator operators, and window washers. The women as charwomen, cleaning the office buildings on Wall Street.
All the women, everybody worked. The fathers had their own jobs, and most of the mothers, regardless of how many children they had and how small the children were, they all worked. And most of them worked during the night.
And the men, they were all porters in those days, back in the 30s. They'd all work and they used to get breakfast. So they'd all come home. They come home for breakfast, Albany Street washer, all the men, all the porters in their overalls in those days. They come home and they have breakfast. They go back to work, come home for lunch, went back to work. And
as time went on, many of the immigrants decided to start and operate their own businesses. They opened grocery stores, butcher shops, liquor stores, and small restaurants. The close-knit community supported the businesses. Eventually, the immigrants joined together to form a cooperative, a restaurant and grocery store that served their people in the downtown community. They called it Morning Star.
They had about 38 members. They chip in maybe $50. Maybe then the second time they need more money, maybe put another $25. But the business was good. They had like a restaurant and a bar.
Although they worked hard, often 6 days a week, they found time to be with their family and friends. The popular place to go was Battery Park.
During the weekday, the mothers had to go. Either they were working or they had to get up early, so they weren't around so much. It became a Saturday, especially in the summertime. You had movable benches. So in other words, you can pick it up and carry it wherever. So you'd end up with all of our people forming in a circle with all their benches. Maybe you'd have 50 benches around, and everybody stayed together, and they talked and, reminisced and talked, whatever.
Trinity Episcopal Church at Broadway and Wall Street reached out to the struggling immigrant community by offering spiritual, emotional, and financial support.
They were just wonderful people. We were what we call today deprived generation. So they wanted to do something for whoever, whether you were Assyrian, Irish, Greek, didn't make any difference. They'd have clubs for us. They had a dispensary. Doctors would come and give you free checkups. Wednesdays, Fridays, they had a library, and their priest always said, we're not here to convert you. You go to your church, but we want you to go to church. And if you don't, come 2 hours for the services, but they never wanted to convert you.
Trinity especially helped the children and teenagers. They established youth guilds, St. Stephen's for the boys and St. Mary's for the girls. During the summer, the children attended a summer camp, Trinity's Seaside Home in Great River, Long Island. Sisters Miriam and Florence Hilda and Father Clow presided over the many activities. In the city, the boys of St. Stephen's Guild had their own basketball team. They played at the Downtown Athletic Club in Lower Manhattan.
The entire neighborhood would come down to see the games. We issued passes to the neighborhood people. Every member of the club, and incidentally there were 60 members, was allowed a certain number of passes, and they issued to all their friends and relatives, so that the entire neighborhood on 2 nights a week was down at the downtown AC watching the basketball games.
The church was their whole life. From the time they stepped foot on the shores of America, the people from the 3 villages sought a place to worship. In Austria-Hungary, there were Greek Catholics, or Uniats. When they settled in New York City, they immediately joined St. Mary's, a Greek Catholic parish on East 13th Street and 2nd Avenue on the Lower East Side of Manhattan.
It was their whole life. It was their whole life. Religiously, socially, it cemented the people together, I guess. And it really shouldn't have, because they all lived in one neighborhood. They seen each other daily.
By the 1920s, many Greek Catholics in the United States had become disillusioned with the American Roman Catholic Church. Many wanted their own priests to come and serve them in the United States, priests who spoke their own language and who understood their Eastern Rite practices. But the majority of their clergy could not come because they were married. If they came, they were forced to leave their wives and children behind in Europe. Louis Dolhey's father, Irenaeus Dolhey, a Uniat priest at St. John the Baptist Church in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, was one.
Bishop Takac was the Uniat bishop at that time, and he started celibacy where the priests couldn't get married. But all the priests in our time were married. They had children. Like us, we had 8 children in Europe. And Bishop Takac forbade my father to bring the family home. So my father wasn't listening to it. Went to see some politicians in Chicago, and he took the church away from the Uniats, from the Uniat Church, and he became independent.
What the Roman Catholic Church failed to realize was the strong connection between the Carpatho-Russians and their Eastern Rite religious practices.
rite does not just mean the liturgy, but it also means ancillary things like the saints that are venerated. And if you weaken one aspect of the religious culture, in the minds of the people, it leads to a weakening of the whole thing. Maybe it's sort of a domino effect, but if you take away the plain chant, you take away the married clergy, you're trying to take away our whole rite.
The desire to retain the Eastern Rite was so strong that by 1907 over 90,000 Greek Catholics, or Uniots, left the Roman Catholic Church. Instead, they joined, and, as some believed, returned to the Orthodox Church, where they were allowed to practice their Eastern Rite traditions, including a married priesthood. In September of 1925, 6 Greek Catholics, including a Greek Catholic priest in New York City, joined the growing exodus and formed a new Orthodox church. They named it St. Mary's, and a decade later, renamed it St. Nicholas. This is how 10th Street began. Within several weeks, they found a home. They rented a portion of a building at 288 East 10th Street and Avenue A. It would become their spiritual home for the next 75 years. Word began to spread within the downtown community. The founders distributed leaflets encouraging the people to join.
We attended the church on 13th Street, which was a Byzantine church. And my father was already attending here because he felt he couldn't convince my mother that it's the exact same church, except we were no longer under the Pope of Rome, that she has to come. So then when she did come, she said it was true, it was beautiful, and it was exactly the same. And as a result, we got a lot of members from that church to return here.
My father came to America in 1923. When he came to New York, he immediately went to St. Nicholas. It was called St. Mary's in those days. And he immediately started, he didn't even go to the 13th Street Church.
As the immigrants came to America, their friends and relatives brought them to St. Mary's Orthodox Church, to 10th Street, to worship.
My cousins, as soon as they came in from Europe, or if they were here, they would immediately follow the rest. And this continued with everyone in the church. When they came to New York, they said, we have to go to church on East 10th Street.
Each time they returned to Europe, the immigrants brought with them word that a new Orthodox community was forming in America. Within time, the villagers in Europe began to embrace Orthodoxy again. What was happening in America was happening in Europe. Many Carpatho-Russians were returning to Orthodoxy. Each Sunday and on holy days, the residents of the Carpatho-Russian community of Lower Manhattan faithfully traveled to St. Mary's on 10th Street.
We used to get on the train here, downtown, right on Morris Street. The Slovaks would take the 3rd Avenue line going to their church. The UNIH used to take another line to go to 13th Street, but we would talk with everyone and then everybody would separate and go their own way. And downtown on a Sunday was empty. You could hear a pin drop. Everybody was in church, no matter what.
As in Europe, the founders of St. Nicholas Church were devoted to their church, attending all the holy days during the week and the Divine Liturgy on Sundays.
Every holy day the church was packed with women, because all the women usually worked at nights. All the women would, so right after work, they would all go to church. Church used to be packed with women on these religious days.
Their children were also taught to understand and to appreciate their religious and cultural heritage. They held language and religious instruction classes and formed a social club known as St. Mary's for the teenagers and young adults. The parish grew, and in time, they began to outgrow the quarters they were renting on 10th Street. At first, they rented a portion of the building. The rent was $50 a month. Within a decade, it doubled. Even then, it was difficult for the parishioners to collect the money to pay the rent.
It was nickels and dimes in those days. Only on the first Sunday of the month they had an extra special collection, so maybe somebody would throw $1. But it was nickel and dimes and pennies in those days.
Besides the weekly collections, the parishioners sought other ways to raise the money. In the 1920s, Father Joseph Havrilyak decided to make a record.
He was a singer. He had a tremendously good voice. And at that period of time, he made a record. And one of his favorite numbers was Yarusin Bill. And that was on the recording, besides the church numbers. Father got us to sell the records to all the parishioners. And we started down at the beginning of Washington Street. We started there and worked our way up Washington Street, Greenwich Street, West Street, all the way up as far as Rector Street, as far as the neighborhood went, and selling the records.
The Carpatho-Russians traditionally had a strong love for music and dancing. In the early years, they held mascaras, or masquerades. The people came dressed in the clothes that they brought with them from Europe. And they hired musicians and bands to play. Many times their own parishioners performed, but often they hired groups from outside the church. In the 1920s and up until the 30s, the bands that played at church dances were often African American.
The Havrilyak brothers, they were the two priests that were there. They get with the musicians, they give them to sing a song or hum a song, and they used to play. They said they played better than the gypsies in Europe. Our songs. Said only black bands in those days. Yeah, he says, Taskakali, they were jumping up to the ceiling, everybody. Yeah.
Through the years, the church also presented plays known as Predstavlenia. There was never a lack of talented actors, actresses, singers, dancers, and comedians. They performed in their native costumes and spoke in their native language. Pona Shomu, our language. And they found another surprising way to raise money.
During the war, you couldn't go out and buy liquor. So for my way, what they did, there was a man that used to belong to our church. I think at that time he was the president of the church. He used to make the liquor.
They used to brew their own whiskey. They get spiritus, the pure alcohol, the 200 proof, 180 proof, dilute it, put a little color in it, and put it into different whiskey bottles.
They served the homemade alcohol at church banquets and weddings.
They would save these bottles, Seagrams and another kind of liquor and another kind of liquor, and they'd pour all the same liquor into the bottles. And like you would think they're the different kinds of brands.
I was working behind a bar, and we had a Mr. Yurashchik. And he says to me, give me this one. I poured it. Next one, he has to give me another one from different bottle. And then I gave him third one. And he says to me, what kind of whiskey you have? All different bottles, it tastes the same.
Despite their efforts, the rent and salaries were still hard to meet. Some members dipped into their own pockets to come up with the money to pay for the priest and choir director.
Father Huha, as I recall, we were paying him $100 a month, and Father Taliha, not Father Taliha, but John Taliha, who was a choir master, $80 a month. And came the end of the month, we didn't have the money to pay. So between Mike and John and myself, we scrounged around in our pocket to make up the balance of what we had, so we could pay off the priest and the choir master. And Father Huha had 3 or 4 little kids. That's the way it was in those days.
In 1929, it became even more difficult. It was the time of the Great Depression. It devastated the entire country.
I remember the bread lines. I remember around the ferries where Governor's Island Ferry on South Street, it would be lines for soup kitchens. Men would just be waiting to get a bowl of soup. Every corner had someone selling fruit. We really weren't deprived because we were poor before the Depression hit. So it didn't really make any difference. We didn't live upscale and had to go downscale. We lived in the same apartment that we did before. No hot water, no steam heat.
By May of 1932, the parishioners, still unable to pay the rent, feared they would lose their church. Father Basil Petresky, who was pastor of St. Mary's at the time, asked Metropolitan Platon, Archbishop of the Orthodox Church in America, to intervene.
Your Eminence, with the rector and committee of St. Mary Carpato-Russian Orthodox Church, appeal to you and beg of you, pray to help us retain the St. Mark's Chapel for all church in the future as we had for the past 7 years. Your Eminence, our congregation consists of hard-working class of people, many at the present time out of work. Therefore, it is very hard for us to continue paying the same rent. We have no place to go and beg of you with the help of God, you may touch the kindness of His Eminence, Reverend W. Manning. All sincerely yours, Reverend Basil Petresky, Josef Jaworski, Michal Gajdosz, George Korotki, Nicholas Rusiniak, and Michal Grab.
The parishioners realized that in order to remain, they needed to purchase the church building. The building was erected in 1884 as a mission chapel to St. Mark's Episcopal Church in the Bowery, which was located several blocks away. The Stuyvesant and Rutherford Pierpont families donated the property and provided funding for the chapel. Today, the original stained glass windows remain, the family's initials etched in its glass. The chapel was designed by James Renwick, Jr., the renowned architect, who also designed several New York City churches: Grace Episcopal Church, St. Bartholomew Episcopal Church, and St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cathedral. The Episcopal Diocese eventually agreed to sell the chapel for $38,500. Now, the parishioners needed to raise the money.
We went around to get pledges, and people said they would give, but you can't draw blood out of a stone. People didn't have it. We didn't have any people that had any income. The women were making $10 a week working in the office. The men were making $20, $25 a week working in restaurants and in office buildings. So that to save $100 during the course of a year, after all expenses, was a little tough on them.
Many of the parishioners went from door to door, asking the people to loan the church the money.
Eventually, we got about 80 families that loaned a minimum of $50, $100, and some $1,000. I think the most was $1,600 in a family.
In 1936, the building became theirs, and the church became incorporated. It was renamed St. Nicholas Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church. It was an independent church, unaffiliated with any diocese. Day and night the parishioners were involved in the church. They often came after their workday ended, down to St. Nicholas, to do whatever work was necessary. This practice continued with each succeeding generation.
My father, when he came in the evening, he used to go to church every evening with the officers, and they would come and they would do work around the church, all gratis. Always did something, because they had no money in those days.
In order to continue to grow, the parishioners of St. Nicholas realized they needed to belong to a larger community. In 1938, they joined the Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Diocese of North and South America, headquartered in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The young people joined the American Carpatho-Russian Youth Association, known as the ACRY, becoming chapter number 4. Many young, gifted, and talented people belonged to St. Nicholas. Peter Cheselka was a young artist who at the age of 15 won first prize at the 40th Annual Boys Club Art Exhibition. He lent his talents to St. Nicholas by painting 2 side altar pictures, which still remain today. Soon after, he received a scholarship to an art school in France, but sadly would never attend. On July 14, 1945, Peter became ill and died at the age of 19. The loss of their youth would occur again and again. Some of their greatest losses occurred during the Second World War. Many who served were born on foreign soil in Carpatho-Russia, but they served because they and their parents loved their new country and the opportunities it had given them.
I was drafted in July of 1941. I was in 51 months and 2 days. 44 months overseas. Leyte, Luzon, Mindoro, Mindanao, New Guinea, Biak.
Unfortunately, during the war, St. Nicholas would be touched by the loss of a number of its young parishioners. The first was Michael Janoschik, whose nickname was Jazzy. Stationed in Maryland for military training, Michael died before he was to leave for overseas. He was the first boy from St. Nicholas to die during the war.
He went in much later after I did. I think that I was in July of 41, and he didn't go until the war started. But he went down to Maryland, and he never got too far. He was in an automobile accident, and that was the end.
Several others also died. These were tragic losses for St. Nicholas Church. Charles Derevyanek was killed in the Battle of the Bulge.
He got killed, and his family brought him home to New York, and he was laid out in number 2 hall. His casket was closed, his picture was there, we had the soldiers, and he was in honor here. And he only had his brother and sister-in-laws here because his family was still in Europe.
Michael Grofik, the only child of Joseph and Mary Grofik, also died.
Mr. and Mrs. Joe Grofik had only this one son, Michael, and he was a bombardier, and his plane had crashed. I think it crashed into the ocean, and this was their only child. And Mrs. Grofik went from veteran hospital to veteran hospital for a long time to see if she could maybe find him, No, she couldn't find him.
To remember the boys in the service, an honor roll was constructed. Peter Cheselka did the artwork. A gold star was placed next to each boy who was killed.
It was pretty huge, and he did the artwork and the names on it, and he added every single name of a soldier from our church that was drafted, and he put the gold stars.
And when the boys came home on leave, the church celebrated. They held dances and parties to welcome them home.
During the war, while we were living up on the east side, the church held dances almost weekly to raise money and to keep the servicemen who came home. There was always someone who came home.
When the war ended, the church continued to grow. The young adult organizations in choir flourished.
After the war, they organized a club, the St. Nicholas Club, besides the choir. They had 100 members. It was jumping. My God, all the veterans, the girls.
Dances and good times, they abounded in this area at that time. I'm talking about the 40s, 50s. You could hear this church from blocks away on a Saturday night because the polka music was so loud.
The young people of St. Nicholas continued the tradition of marrying within their own faith. Many married parishioners whose families came from the 3 villages. This tradition of marrying within the faith continues today.
I never got involved with a girl other than Orthodox. Because I knew if I ever, I think my father would have disowned me, my mother, I assumed they would. So I didn't even date anybody that wasn't an Orthodox. I didn't really, it didn't bother me. I guess there was enough of our girls.
Mary Russinack attended St. Nicholas. Her future husband, Louis Dolhe, attended St. John's Church in Perth Amboy, New Jersey.
I met my wife, my future wife, at a dance in Bayonne, New Jersey.
We just met at the dance. You know, years ago, that was our only enjoyment, is going to dances. Even here on 10th Street or any other, that's the only place you would go to meet people.
I fixed her shoe, she broke her shoe. And we started dating, and that's it, After 3 months, I told her either we get married or we forget it, because I had to travel to New Jersey all the time. So then we got married. And
Mary Janoschik met her husband Joseph Medvecki at an ACRY convention.
Who do I bump into? But two fellas. One whose name on the ticket said Joseph Medvecki, and the other one was his engineer friend. And I looked at it, and he started talking, and I says, I said, you know Medvecki. I know all the Medveckis. My sister-in-law is a Medvecki. How could you be a Medvecki? And after that, we started to date. September we met. December we were engaged. And in May of the following year, we were married.
Ann Vislaki met her husband Michael Saloni at St. Nicholas Church.
Oh, well, he used to come to the church once in a while, to the dances, everybody to meet one another. He'd be at the bar, 10th Street bar, with all his other friends there. Then after, I would meet him at some of the weddings. And then after, I guess he started to go after me.
There was nothing like a St. Nicholas wedding. They were always large, often 300 to 400 people, sometimes as much as 700 people. It seemed as if the entire church attended.
You enjoyed yourself because it was everybody you knew. You felt comfortable. It's all relatives, friends that you grew up with. To me, there's nothing like one of our weddings.
St. Nicholas Church Hall, more often than not, served as the reception hall for the wedding.
And the women and men would cook. They would cook themselves. There was no such thing as catering in those days. There'd be 300-400 people. But full meals. It wasn't football wedding. It was strictly full meals.
I know when any of us got married, my mother never got out of the kitchen because she was always helping, and all the friends and relatives used to help.
While some may go to a dozen or more weddings in a lifetime, it was not unusual for most St. Nicholas parishioners to go to several dozen, if not more.
Always a dozen, never a bride. Well, it was mostly relatives. When you got a lot of relatives, one after the other, they get married, and they grab the first one who's available. So that if you're single, and they know it, they come after you.
Nothing beats our weddings. I just went through one with my daughter. Again, it's family. And the only problem you have is there's 900 people you really should invite to the wedding, and you can't.
I had to get married in 10th Street. There was no doubt in my mind. That's where my grandparents got married, my parents got married, we all grew up, It's home. But I had to have my special people there. There were special people that had to be there. Father Beskid, our current priest, had to be there. A longtime family friend, Father Hutyan, had to be there. I've known him my whole entire life. And then Bishop Nicholas, who was my priest as a child. I was baptized the day before he arrived and started his ministry at 10th Street. And for the first 10 years of my life, he was always there.
To love and respect you, to be faithful to you always.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, good, come on.
Like most families, the parishioners of St. Nicholas Church had disagreements. However, in the early 1960s, one disagreement would cause irreparable damage to the parish. Families were split. Sadly, a number of people left St. Nicholas, never to return.
People were throwing buttons for money into baskets. People were resentful of each other already. It was just a bloody mess. What it did, it really split families in half. Some went, some stayed, some didn't.
I stay on 10th Street because I thought this is the roots that everybody has. Whoever comes, I listen to people, and I always thought 10th Street, it's a root, and I should stay here. Why should I walk away from my own church?
Some people left and went to start another church. That was a very traumatic thing. Thank God, and one of the reasons why we survived was because of us being such a strong family.
The church split failed to destroy the parishioners' devotion to St. Nicholas Church. The church continued to flourish and to welcome new immigrants from the 3 villages and elsewhere. Many instinctively migrated to 10th Street, just as their parents and grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins had done decades before. And like clockwork each Sunday, the church bells of St. Nicholas rang, beckoning people to come to join their family and friends in fellowship and worship.
I remember when my grandmother used to live on 7th Street, and sometimes before church we would go to her house and we'd be talking, and she'd be making stuffed cabbage because after we'd be coming to her house, or chicken or whatever she was making. And I guess about 10 to, you could hear the bells from St. Nicholas. And it was time for us to take our walk over and get to church on time.
I grew up in an apartment. It was right around the corner here, St. Mark's Place. I used to come here under duress. I didn't want to come to church when I was a kid. Actually, that building across the street, the Boys Club, was more my home than any other place. I used to have to come here for Russian school and religious catechism school, and I played hooky a lot. My mother once asked me, she says, don't you want to go to heaven? Just trying to convince me to come to church. And I said, no, I'd rather go to the Boys Club.
From generation to generation, the young people of St. Nicholas have felt a close connection to their church and to each other. These bonds have remained throughout their lifetimes.
And I think that's why I'm so close to churches, because the way my parents, and that's what you talked about when you came home. We have to do this, we have to try and do that, we have to try and do this for the church, maybe we can do this for the church. And you know, if you hear it all the time, it just becomes part of you too.
For more than 30 years, from the 1960s to the 1990s, Lou Dolhe was choir director in Cantor, and as many parishioners before and after him, after working his regular job, Lou went to his church job. Lou's regular job was running a nightclub, along with his wife Mary and her brother Charles Rusnak. Club 802 in Brooklyn was renamed 2001 Odyssey. It was also the backdrop for the movie Saturday Night Fever.
Lou is a national treasure. Lou Dolhe is unique in so many different ways. And of all of the people that had an excuse for not coming to church on Sunday, he was it.
I used to go to bed at 5 in the morning, maybe 6, and I had to be here at 9:30, 10 o'clock. And for 35 years I did. And we had choir rehearsals on Friday and Christmas caroling.
We had a good time, and Louis was a big part of that. He was a very easygoing kind of guy. He wanted to keep the kids together. I think that in spite of the fact that the music and the church is very important to Lou Dolhe, I think the fact that he kept the kids involved in the church is a big part of what he contributed to the church.
There were a couple of kids come up to me to one of the affairs we had, and he says, "Lou, thank you for saving my life." I said, "How did that?" Well, he said, "You can be so busy putting shows on and things like that, that I didn't go bad, you know. I was involved in the church."
The parishioners always gave monetarily to the church. They also gave their time, working hard to keep St. Nicholas going, whether it was holding an office, baking cakes to raise money, or repairing a floor or roof.
I became the president of the Altar Society, and I don't know when it was, but anyway, I retired last year. So it was about 15, 20 years, something like that, and we did all right.
I think I was the only teacher in the parish, licensed New York City school teacher, and that gave me qualifications to teach Sunday school. And I think that's why I got into it, and I don't remember which of the priests suggested that I do it, but I did teach Sunday school, I think, I don't know, maybe for 20 years, 25 years.
And he was the financial secretary. So I said, "Now who's going to take the job? We have nobody a job, you can't leave." He said, "You could do it." And I said, he said, "Better days are coming, Mary." I said, "Oh yes, for you, but not for me." Anyway, I took that temporary assignment, and that temporary assignment turned into about 10 years.
There were always good cooks at St. Nicholas, men and women who prepared food for the coffee socials after Sunday services and at church affairs and banquets.
Sometimes I make a soup, and all the children, they tell mothers that why she don't make soup like that. I put macaroni in the soup, vegetables, it's a chicken soup sometimes. And whatever we could make, we bring. But not only me, other people also. They cook and bring and sort of enjoying together. We have a picnic every Sunday. We have a beautiful relationship.
Krepli, they like it best, and piroga. So I make a piroga, I make it krepli. I get up 4 o'clock almost every Sunday. 4 o'clock, I make 10 dozen, bring it to the church. I remember 1982. I make 2,250 donuts plus 296 collagen. I used 1,025 pound flour.
And besides good cooks, St. Nicholas Church was always blessed with professional carpenters, electricians, painters, and plumbers. Several parishioners even risked their lives to clean the church gutters.
You had to go down, and they had a screen to cover up the gutters that the dirt wouldn't fly. And the only way you get down there by rope. So one day me and Louis went up. Louis was on the top, and I tied myself with the rope and go down and clean the gutter. some of the people that they find out. And when I went to Coney Island, they says that 10th Street doesn't have money to pay for men to clean the gutter, but you have to go on a rope that throw you off the roof. Well, I guess it was funny to them that was danger, but wasn't that bad. It was a danger I wouldn't do it.
For most of its history, St. Nicholas did not have a traditional Orthodox icon screen, or iconostas, to cover the main and side altars of the church. The church's original iconostas was removed during remodeling in the 1930s. 60 years later, it still hadn't been replaced. In 1996, Mary Nanko, the oldest member of St. Nicholas Church at the time, generously donated a large portion of the money for its construction.
God was good to us. We came to this country, we work hard, but we were dressed, we were fed, we had a home, and we always saved some money. When Father came to bless the house, I told him, I said, Father, and I made a will. So when I told him how much, finally I said 50,000. 50,000? I said, yes. He said, that's very nice of you. He couldn't, for a minute, he was speechless.
We've made some great improvements in that church over the last 10 years. We're making the building strong to keep the church going, so that people can come into the church and practice their faith. But if we don't keep them involved, we're going to have a strong building and an empty church.
Each year, the pews of St. Nicholas continued to fill with new members, many of whom were immigrants who came from the three towns. In the spring of 1968, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia. Many escaped to America. Some came to St. Nicholas because it was the closest thing to home. George Kobor, a professional chef from Kamionka, came in 1969. Since then, he and his family have cooked and catered for numerous church affairs.
Well, I do it for other people and for the church, nobody else. And that's my pleasure too, when the people enjoy my food too. That's why I like this church, because I met my wife in a church picnic. She came from Europe, I came from Europe in 1969. I was only 2 months here and I met her in a picnic, and we are here cooking.
I came in 1969 in May. I'm from Yaravina. I like to help. That's it, like if you can't help, I'm a good helper.
In the summer of 2001, 40 members of St. Nicholas traveled to Europe to learn more about their roots. They visited the three towns, many for the first time. They walked the same roads their ancestors walked, saw the homes they lived in, and worshipped in their churches. Today, the makeup of 10th Street Church has changed. Because of intermarriages and conversions, the church is no longer just Carpatho-Russian. Indian, Latino, Italian, and Irish are a few of the ethnic groups that are now part of St. Nicholas Church. For many, it too has become their second home, their second family. And together, they have celebrated many births and weddings and mourned many deaths.
And it really is a family on all different levels. It's from very young people that you know their children and their grandchildren, to the older people who have been around for a long time that you remember as the grown-ups when you were a kid. And it's part of lives. We go to weddings and more funerals. There was one year when we had 12 funerals, unfortunately, a couple of years ago. And my friends in school would say, another one? And how many, you're losing your whole family. And they don't understand that these are people who are not related to me by blood, but that are close to my life and have in some way affected who I am and that are important to me.
In all, close to 24 priests have passed through the doors of St. Nicholas Church to serve at its altar. In 1972, a new priest was assigned to the parish. It was meant to be a temporary assignment, but instead lasted for almost 10 years.
And when I became the pastor here, I found that the parish and all of its people was a very warm parish, a very real parish, a very sincere parish. Also, that these people, despite some problems now and then, but these people were very much united together because either they were related to one another, or they came from the same village, or they just expressed and gave witness for true love for one another.
Within a short time, Father Nicholas embraced the neighborhood, making friends with other local parish priests, shop owners, and the local police precinct. He soon became precinct chaplain. The parishioners of St. Nicholas began to realize that Father Nicholas had a certain talent, the talent of persuasion.
Well, when he was here as our pastor, he was a politician because he knew how to get things done in a way that wouldn't make you feel bad or feel like you were being put on the spot.
He would turn around and he would go buy something. And sure enough, he would turn around and if something cost $1,000, he would collect $2,000 for it. If something cost $5,000, he'd collect $7,000 for it. So we'd make a profit on the stuff we'd buy. It got to the point finally with John just wouldn't even question what he bought. Just go and do it, because I know you're going to get the money back plus anyway.
He was like a father to us. He was very involved with the youth. We were always doing something with Bishop Nicholas.
My happiest memories of St. Nicholas, I think there are many. There are many. I don't recall any disappointing or sad memories. I can say honestly, this was one of my best pastorates. This was where I felt very comfortable. I was at home.
In 1985, Father Nicholas became bishop of the Carpatho-Russian Diocese of North America. 12 years later, he was elevated to the rank of Metropolitan by the Patriarch Bartholomew, Archbishop of Constantinople. Most parishioners live outside Manhattan. Despite this, they continue to attend 10th Street, some traveling as long as 2 hours each Sunday.
But most of the people from the parish are from the other boroughs in New York City. We have people that come in from New Jersey. We have people that come from upstate New York, various distant places. So it's different in that sense because normally when the people usually live in the same area that the church is.
The Orthodox religion is not just a part of their history, but a way of life for the parishioners of St. Nicholas, as well as the other Orthodox Christians throughout the world.
It was just sort of something that was part of life. My grandparents, my parents were very much involved in following the rules, let's say. If it was a holiday, you couldn't work around the house, you didn't mow the lawn, you didn't cut the hedges, you didn't do anything. This was a holy day. It was a day to go to church. It was a day to pray. During Lent, you didn't eat meat. Every Friday, you ate the fish. On Sundays, you wouldn't wash clothes. This was important. It was part of life. It was something that was there from the first moment I can remember. You believe in God, you go to church, this is who you are.
I think the people here are I would say they're about the same as any other place. I mean, you have the troubles, but everyone does. In every parish, there's always something that's happening. But what I like here is that, and the Metropolitan told me this before I came here. He said that they'll fight and they'll scream and they'll argue and then they'll go and have a sandwich and a beer and everything is okay. And that's what I like, is that people are able to say how they feel to each other And yet at the end of the day, you know, everything is okay. You know, there's no hard feelings. And I think everybody in our place has, you know, the best interests of the church at heart.
It's the best atmosphere, I think, that anybody could grow up into. I mean, where else can you really get your entire family involved? Kids, grandchildren, in-laws, outlaws, the whole bunch. They're all here, and it makes it something special. My son Johnny said to me not long ago, you know, Dad, he says, what I like about our church, he says, that Grandma's there, you're there, my sister's there, my brother's there, he said, and not only that, he said, but there's people and friends and family that go back. He says, so no matter in which direction you look, he says, there's a continuation. There's like a chain. He says that he's not only family, but friends and friends of the family. He said, that's what makes it unique.
Now and ever and forever.
The reason why the church has lasted so long and why it's still really vibrant is because you have this wonderful collection of people that really feel that they belong to each other.
My father's brothers, children, married out of the faith, and they really don't go to 10th Street. And a big thing for them was to come and see the church that their grandparents, their parents, their fathers and mothers attended. I remember them saying they want to bring their children so they could see this church, what it's like, and where it is, and it's still there.
It always amazed me that at that particular moment on Sunday morning, or every other Orthodox church in the world is singing exactly the same words and the same song. When you think about it, it's important to feel that you're part of something that's lasted as long as the Orthodox Church has.